The musket ball whistled past Major George Washington's ear, splintering bark from the oak tree behind him. It was May 28th, 1754, and the 22-year-old Virginian had just fired the first shot of what would become a global conflict. In the misty forests near present-day Uniontown, Pennsylvania, Washington's small force had ambushed a French reconnaissance party, killing their leader, Ensign Joseph Callan de Villiers de Jumonville. What Washington believed to be a simple skirmish would ignite the French and Indian War, reshaping the destiny of North America. The shot that echoed through the Allegheny wilderness that morning represented far more than a young colonial officer's aggressive patrol. It marked the collision of two expanding empires, British and French, each determined to control the lucrative Ohio River Valley. For decades, both nations had eyed this fertile region, rich in fur-bearing animals and strategic river passages. The French, under the leadership of Governor-General Marquis Duquesne, had begun constructing a chain of forts from Lake Erie to the Ohio River, directly challenging British territorial claims and colonial expansion. Washington's mission had originated from Virginia Governor Robert Dinwiddie's determination to assert British sovereignty over the contested lands. The young major, despite his inexperience, possessed the ambition and connections necessary for such a delicate diplomatic and military venture. His older brother Lawrence's marriage into the influential Fairfax family had opened doors, while his surveying expeditions beyond the Blue Ridge Mountains had given him invaluable knowledge of frontier conditions and Native American relations. The French response to Washington's attack came swiftly and decisively. Captain Louis Callan de Villiers, brother of the slain Jumonville, marched from Fort Duquesne with 600 French soldiers and allied warriors. Washington, meanwhile, hastily constructed a crude stockade he optimistically named Fort Necessity. The location, chosen in haste, sat in a marshy meadow surrounded by wooded hills, tactically indefensible against a determined enemy. On July 3, 1754, de Villiers encircled Fort Necessity with his superior force. Rain poured steadily, turning the fort's interior into a muddy quagmire, while French and Indian marksmen picked off defenders from the surrounding forest. Washington's men, many of them untrained militia, huddled behind inadequate earthworks as bullets splintered the hastily erected palisade. The young commander's military education, gained primarily through reading Caesar's commentaries and military manuals, proved insufficient for the realities of frontier warfare. As evening approached, de Villiers offered terms for surrender. Washington, his ammunition running low and casualties mounting, reluctantly agreed to negotiations. The resulting capitulation, written in French, which Washington could not read fluently, contained a damaging admission. The document stated that Washington acknowledged the assassination of Jumonville, a diplomatic catastrophe that would haunt his reputation and provide French propaganda with powerful ammunition. The defeat at Fort Necessity marked Washington's inglorious introduction to military command, but it also revealed characteristics that would serve him well in future conflicts. Despite the tactical disaster, he maintained the loyalty of his men through shared hardship and personal courage under fire. His willingness to accept responsibility for the defeat, while privately learning from his mistakes, demonstrated the resilience that would later make him indispensable to the colonial cause. This opening chapter of the French-Indian War established patterns that would define the conflict. European military traditions clashed with frontier realities, while Native American alliances proved decisive in determining local outcomes. Young officers like Washington gained hard-won experience in wilderness warfare, while established leaders on both sides began positioning themselves for the larger struggle ahead. The wilderness had spoken, and its message was clear. Control of North America would be determined not by European diplomacy, but by blood, courage, and adaptability in the unforgiving forests of the New World, in the longhouses of the Mohawk Nation. A figure of immense influence prepared for war. Sir William Johnson, the Irish-born superintendent of Indian affairs, possessed something more valuable than gold in the coming conflict: the trust and alliance of the powerful Iroquois Confederacy. As 1755 dawned cold and promising, Johnson understood that victory in the French and Indian War would depend not merely on European tactics, but on securing Native American partnerships that had shaped regional power balances. For generations, Johnson's rise from humble Irish immigrant to one of colonial America's most powerful men represented the fluid social mobility possible on the frontier. Arriving in the Mohawk Valley in 1738 to manage his uncle's estate, he quickly recognized that success required understanding and respecting Native American customs rather than attempting to impose European social structures. He learned Mohawk languages, participated in tribal councils, and according to contemporary accounts, married Molly Brant, sister of the influential war chief Joseph Brant, cementing his position within Iroquois society. The strategic importance of Johnson's Native American alliances became clear when British military leaders began planning their 1755 campaign against French positions. General Edward Braddock, the newly arrived British commander-in-chief, embodied everything wrong with European military thinking applied to American conditions. His rigid adherence to conventional warfare tactics, combined with contempt for colonial soldiers and Native American fighting methods, would prove disastrous in the wilderness campaigns ahead. Historical context drawn from Fred Anderson's Crucible of War, the 7 Years' War, and the Fate of Empire in British North America, Oxford University Press. 2000. Johnson's influence extended far beyond military matters into the complex world of frontier diplomacy. At the Albany Congress of 1754, he had warned colonial leaders that French agents were successfully winning Native American allies through generous gifts and respectful treatment. The French, he argued, understood that Native Americans were sovereign peoples requiring diplomatic negotiation rather than subjects to be commanded. This fundamental difference in approach would determine which European power could maintain effective alliances during the coming war. The test of Johnson's diplomatic skills came during the Crown Point expedition of 1755. While Braddock marched toward disaster at Fort Duquesne, Johnson led a mixed force of colonial militia, British regulars, and Mohawk warriors toward the French fortress at Crown Point on Lake Champlain. His army represented a unique fusion of European military organization and Native American woodland tactics, a combination that would prove essential for success in North American warfare. On September 8, 1755, Johnson's force encountered Baron Ludwig Auguste Dieskau's French and Indian army near Lake George. The battle that followed demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of colonial Native American military cooperation. Johnson's Mohawk allies, led by the famous war chief Hendrik Theonogen, provided crucial intelligence about French movements, while his colonial militiamen showed surprise. The Battle of Lake George began disastrously for the British when Dieskau ambushed an advance column, killing the elderly Hendrik and scattering colonial troops. However, Johnson's main force, fighting from hastily constructed breastworks, repelled repeated French attacks. The engagement showcased Johnson's ability to coordinate different military traditions, European artillery, colonial marksmanship, and Mohawk woodland tactics into an effective fighting force. Johnson's wound during the battle, a musket ball through the thigh, enhanced his reputation among both colonial and Native American allies. His willingness to share dangers with common soldiers, combined with his genuine respect for Mohawk customs and fighting methods, created loyalty that transcended cultural boundaries. The victory at Lake George, while tactically limited, provided a desperately needed morale boost after Braddock's devastating defeat. The aftermath of Lake George revealed Johnson's understanding of the war's broader implications. Rather than pursuing the retreating French, he focused on consolidating gains and maintaining Native American alliances. His construction of Fort William Henry at the southern end of Lake George created a strategic base for future operations, while providing employment and trade opportunities that kept Iroquois warriors committed to the British cause. Johnson recognized that this war would be won not through single decisive battles, but through sustained campaigns that required long-term Native American partnership and colonial commitment to frontier defense. General Edward Braddock's scarlet uniform gleamed in the dappled sunlight filtering through the Pennsylvania forest canopy as his magnificent army wound through the wilderness toward Fort Duquesne. It was July 9th, 1755, and the British commander-in-chief embodied supreme confidence in European military superiority. Behind him stretched a column of over 2,000 men, British regulars in perfect formation, colonial militia struggling to maintain discipline, and a massive baggage train containing everything from artillery pieces to fine china for the general's dining table. Braddock had no doubt that French resistance would crumble before such overwhelming force and professional military precision. The general's contempt for American fighting methods had been evident since his arrival in Virginia that February. Colonial officers like George Washington, serving as volunteer aides-de-camp, repeatedly warned about the dangers of conventional European tactics in wilderness warfare. Braddock dismissed such concerns with aristocratic disdain, declaring that the savages may, indeed, be a formidable enemy to your raw American militia, but upon the king's regular and disciplined troops, sir, it is impossible they should make any impression. Washington's attempts to incorporate colonial and Native American tactical advice met with consistent rebuffs. The young Virginian had learned hard lessons at Fort Necessity about wilderness warfare's unique demands, but Braddock refused to modify his rigid adherence to military regulations developed for European battlefields. Native American scouts, essential for gathering intelligence about French positions and movements, found themselves marginalized and insulted by British officers who viewed them as unreliable auxiliaries rather than valuable allies. The expedition's slow progress through Pennsylvania's rugged terrain reflected Braddock's determination to maintain European military standards regardless of practical considerations. His engineers carved a military road 12 feet wide through virgin forest, constructing bridges over streams and clearing paths suitable for heavy artillery. The massive baggage train, loaded with camp equipment befitting a gentleman's campaign, further slowed movement to barely 3 miles per day. French scouts shadowed the column's advance, reporting every detail of British strength and intentions to Captain Daniel Leonard de Beaujeu at Fort Duquesne. Captain de Beaujeu represented everything Braddock failed to understand about successful North American warfare. The French officer had spent years on the frontier, earning respect from Native American allies through personal courage and cultural sensitivity. As Braddock's army approached, de Beaujeu assembled a force of fewer than 900 men, French regulars, Canadian militia, and warriors from multiple tribes, including Ottawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations. His battle plan rejected European conventions in favor of tactics adapted to forest warfare and Native American fighting methods. On July 9th, the armies collided approximately 8 miles from Fort Duquesne near the Monongahela River. Braddock's advance guard, led by Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Gage, initially scattered de Beaujeu's smaller force through disciplined volley fire. The French captain fell in the opening moments, but his Native American allies, trained in woodland warfare, quickly adapted their tactics to exploit the terrain's advantages. They disappeared into the surrounding forest, using trees and rocks for cover while pouring devastating fire into the exposed British column. Military tactical analysis referenced from John Greenier's The First Way of War, American Warmaking. On the Frontier, Cambridge University Press. 2005, the disciplined British regulars, trained for European battlefields where enemies fought in formation, found themselves helpless against invisible opponents. Their rigid formations became death traps, as French and Native American marksmen picked off officers and sergeants, destroying command structure and unit cohesion. Soldiers fired volleys into empty forests while warriors moved through the undergrowth, striking at will before melting away into the wilderness. Washington, despite suffering from fever, repeatedly urged Braddock to allow colonial troops to fight from behind trees in Indian fashion. The general angrily refused, striking colonial soldiers with the flat of his sword when they sought cover. His determination to maintain European military dignity in the face of tactical disaster cost precious lives and ultimately determined the battle's outcome. The massacre continued for 3 hours as British discipline collapsed under sustained assault from an enemy they could neither see nor engage effectively. Braddock, mounted conspicuously on horseback, presented an irresistible target for Native American marksmen. 4 horses were shot from under him before a musket ball finally struck him down, mortally wounded. With their commanding general fallen and casualties mounting horrifically, British resistance finally crumbled into panicked retreat. Washington emerged from the disaster as one of the few British officers whose reputation survived intact. His courage under fire, combined with his efforts to organize an orderly withdrawal, impressed both colonial and British observers. The young Virginian's survival. Despite having 2 horses shot from under him and 4 bullet holes through his coat, seemed almost miraculous to contemporary witnesses and enhanced his growing reputation for battlefield leadership and personal bravery. Captain Robert Rogers crouched motionless in the pre-dawn darkness, his weathered face painted with charcoal and clay to blend with the forest shadows. Around him, 28 carefully selected men waited for his signal, their gear muffled to prevent any sound that might alert French sentries at Fort Carillon. It was October 1756, and Rogers was about to lead one of his famous ranging expeditions deep into enemy territory, gathering intelligence that would prove invaluable too. British commanders struggling to understand French movements in the Champlain Valley. Rogers represented a new breed of colonial warrior, who combined European military discipline with Native American woodland skills. Born in Methuen, Massachusetts, he had spent his youth on the New Hampshire frontier, learning, tracking, wilderness survival, and guerrilla warfare tactics from both peaceful Native American neighbors and hostile raiding parties. Unlike regular British officers trained in European military academies, Rogers developed his tactical knowledge through hard experience in the unforgiving wilderness. The formation of Rogers Rangers in 1755 marked a revolutionary development in colonial warfare. While British generals like Braddock dismissed irregular fighting methods, forward-thinking officers recognized the need for specialized units capable of matching French and Native American opponents in wilderness combat. Rogers recruited his men from experienced frontiersmen, hunters, trappers, and militia veterans who possessed the skills necessary for long-range reconnaissance and guerrilla warfare. The Rangers. The first major engagement occurred during the winter of 1756, when Rogers led 50 men on a daring raid against the Abenaki village of St. Francis. The mission required a grueling march through frozen wilderness, carefully avoiding French patrols while gathering intelligence about enemy supply lines and Native American alliances. Rogers' detailed reports provided British commanders with their first accurate assessment of French defensive preparations and the extent of Native American support for their cause. Ranger tactics and organization details drawn from Burt Garfield. Loeschers, The History of Rogers Rangers, Heritage Books. 1969, Rogers developed what became known as Rogers' Rules of Ranging, a practical guide to wilderness warfare that emphasized stealth, adaptability, and survival skills. These 28 rules covered everything from campsite selection and sentry rotation to methods for crossing rivers without leaving tracks. His emphasis on small unit tactics, individual marksmanship, and rapid movement through difficult terrain created a new model for American military operations that would influence warfare for generations. The Rangers' most famous exploit occurred during the Battle on Snowshoes in January 1758. Rogers had led 74 men on a winter reconnaissance mission toward Fort Carillon when they encountered a much larger French and Native American force. The engagement fought on frozen Lake George demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of Ranger tactics when facing superior numbers in unfavorable terrain. The battle began when Rogers' advanced scouts spotted smoke rising from a French camp. Rather than withdrawing immediately, Rogers decided to attack, hoping to capture prisoners and gather intelligence about enemy strength. The assault initially succeeded, overrunning the French position and capturing several soldiers. However, the sound of gunfire alerted a much larger enemy force commanded by Captain Florimond de Lauzon, who quickly surrounded the Rangers with over 200 men, fighting in deep snow while wearing heavy winter clothing. The Rangers found their mobility advantages neutralized by the terrain. Rogers struck in the head by a musket ball that creased. His skull continued commanding his men while blood streamed down his face. The engagement lasted several hours as Rangers used their superior marksmanship to hold off repeated attacks. But ammunition shortages and mounting casualties gradually weakened their position. The Rangers' escape from the battle on snowshoes became legendary throughout the colonies. Rogers divided his surviving men into small groups, taking different routes back to Fort William Henry to confuse French pursuit. He personally led the most dangerous group, drawing enemy attention. While his men scattered through the wilderness, his own escape involved sliding down a cliff face onto the frozen lake below, a feat that French pursuers deemed impossible and abandoned their chase. Rogers' survival and the intelligence gathered during the mission provided valuable insights into French defensive preparations for the upcoming campaign season. His detailed reports described enemy troop strengths, supply difficulties, and the locations of defensive positions around Fort Carillon. More importantly, his Rangers had demonstrated that colonial forces could match French and Native American opponents in wilderness warfare when properly trained and equipped. The psychological impact of Rogers' Rangers extended far beyond their tactical achievements. French commanders, previously confident in their ability to control the wilderness, found themselves constantly harassed by an enemy who appeared and disappeared like ghosts. Native American allies, impressed by the Rangers' woodcraft and fighting skills, began questioning French assurances about British military incompetence. Rogers had proven that Americans could master their own continent's unique warfare demands. Marie-Joseph Jellic stood in the shadows of Quebec's lower town market, her weathered hands sorting through vegetables while her sharp eyes catalogued the British ships anchored in the St. Lawrence River. Two casual observers. She appeared to be merely another French-Canadian woman conducting daily shopping. But beneath her humble exterior operated one of the war's most effective intelligence agents. As 1759 dawned with British forces preparing their final assault on New France, networks of spies and informants would prove as crucial as armies in determining the conflict's outcome. The world of espionage during the French and Indian War operated far from the romanticized image of later spy fiction. Real intelligence work involved ordinary people, traders, servants, Native American messengers, and colonial women who possessed access to information and motivation. To share it with one side or another, these unsung heroes risked their lives not for glory or monetary reward, but from conviction that their chosen cause represented the best hope for their families' and communities' survival. Angelique's story began in 1748, when British forces burned her family's farm during King George's War. Widowed and left with 3 young children, she had fled to Quebec, where French authorities provided modest assistance in exchange for her willingness to gather information about British activities. Her position as a laundress for wealthy English-speaking merchants gave her access to private conversations, letters, and household guests, whose identities revealed important intelligence about British plans and capabilities. The spy networks that operated throughout the French and Indian War reflected the conflict's complex cultural and political landscape. Native American communities often played multiple sides, providing information to both French and British agents while pursuing their own diplomatic objectives. Traders moved freely between hostile territories, carrying messages and intelligence along with their commercial goods. Colonial women, frequently overlooked by military authorities, proved particularly effective at gathering information through domestic and social connections. Intelligence operations context drawn from Kenneth Roberts' Northwest Passage, Doubleday, 1937, and historical records from the National Archives on the British side. Major Robert Rogers' Rangers served dual functions as both combat troops and intelligence gatherers. Their deep penetration raids into French territory provided detailed maps, troop strength estimates, and assessments of Native American alliance patterns. Rogers himself frequently operated behind enemy lines in civilian disguise, his knowledge of French language and customs allowing him to gather information from one of the war's most dramatic intelligence coups occurred in 1758 when a French deserter named Jean-Baptiste arrived at Fort William Henry carrying detailed plans of French defensive positions around Fort Carillon. The information provided by a network of disaffected French soldiers and Canadian militia, revealed weaknesses in the fortress's northeastern approach that British commanders had not suspected. However, General James Abercrombie's subsequent assault failed to exploit this intelligence effectively, resulting in one of the war's bloodiest British defeats. The role of women in wartime intelligence operations became particularly evident during the Siege of Quebec in 1759. French authorities, recognizing that British forces would be more likely to trust women and less likely to suspect them of espionage, recruited dozens of female agents to monitor British activities and troop movements. These women operated through legitimate occupations, serving as laundresses, cooks, and seamstresses for British officers, while systematically reporting on military preparations and strategic discussions. Counterintelligence operations proved equally important as both sides attempted to identify and neutralize enemy spy networks. The French established a sophisticated system for monitoring British communications, intercepting letters and dispatches that revealed strategic intentions and troop dispositions. British commanders, initially naive about intelligence security, gradually learned to use coded communications and false information to confuse French intelligence gathering. The most significant intelligence breakthrough of the war occurred in September 1759, when British agents discovered the location of the path leading up the cliffs to the Plains of Abraham above Quebec. This intelligence, provided by a French informant whose identity remains disputed by historians, enabled General James Wolfe's forces to achieve tactical surprise and position themselves for the decisive battle that would determine New France's fate. Native American intelligence networks operated according to their own complex diplomatic and strategic calculations. Tribal leaders like the Oneida chief Shikellamy maintained connections with both French and British agents, providing selective information that advanced their people's interests while avoiding complete commitment to either European power. These sophisticated diplomatic strategies recognized that the war's outcome would fundamentally reshape the balance of power in North America, requiring careful positioning to ensure tribal survival regardless of which European empire ultimately prevailed. The intelligence war's most poignant casualties were often the agents, themselves ordinary people who chose sides in a conflict that would determine their homeland's future. Many, like Marie-Joseph Angelique, disappeared into history's shadows, their contributions unrecognized by official records but essential to their chosen cause's ultimate success. Their courage and sacrifice represented the human cost of a conflict that transformed North America through the accumulated efforts of countless individuals, whose names would never appear in official military histories. General James Wolfe stood at the prow of his transport vessel, gazing through the morning mist at Quebec's seemingly impregnable cliffs rising from the St. Lawrence River. It was September 12th, 1759, and the young British commander faced the most challenging assignment of his military career. After months of unsuccessful attempts to breach the French defenses, Wolfe had conceived a desperate plan to scale the supposedly unclimbable heights west of the city and force a decisive battle on the Plains of Abraham. Success would deliver all of New France into British hands. Failure would end both his career and quite possibly his life. The 29-year-old Wolfe embodied both the promise and contradictions of British military leadership during the French and Indian War. Born into a military family, he had received his commission at age 14 and participated in campaigns across Europe, earning recognition for personal courage and tactical innovation. However, his thin frame, red hair, and occasionally erratic behavior led some subordinates to question whether he possessed the temperament necessary for independent command in North America's unique warfare environment. Opposing Wolfe on Quebec's fortified heights stood Lieutenant General Louis-Joseph de Montcalm-Gozan, Marquis de Montcalm, a seasoned French professional whose European military reputation rivaled any commander in North America. Montcalm had arrived in New France in 1756 and quickly demonstrated his tactical brilliance through victories at Fort Oswego, Fort William Henry, and Fort Carillon. His aggressive defensive strategy had frustrated British attempts to penetrate the Canadian heartland while his diplomatic skills maintained crucial Native American alliances. The siege of Quebec had begun in June 1759 when British Admiral Charles Saunders successfully navigated his fleet through the treacherous waters of the St. Lawrence River, a feat French commanders had believed impossible. Wolfe's army of 8,000 troops established positions on the Isle of Orleans and at Point Levis, beginning a methodical bombardment of Quebec's lower town while probing for weaknesses in the city's natural and artificial defenses. Battle. Details and strategic context drawn from C.P. Stacy's Quebec, 1759. The Siege and the Battle, Macmillan, 1859. Montcalm's defensive strategy relied on Quebec's natural advantages and the approaching Canadian winter. To defeat the British invasion, the city's position on cliffs above the St. Lawrence made direct assault nearly impossible, while French control of supply lines from Montreal ensured adequate provisions for a prolonged siege. Montcalm calculated that British forces, operating far from their bases and dependent on naval supply lines, would be forced to withdraw before winter weather made river navigation impossible. Throughout the summer months, both commanders engaged in a deadly chess match of maneuver and counter-maneuver. Wolfe attempted several unsuccessful assaults on French positions, including a disastrous attack at Montmorency Falls that cost him over 400 casualties with little to show for the sacrifice. These failures, combined with deteriorating health and criticism from his subordinates, drove Wolfe to increasingly desperate measures as the campaign season drew toward its close. The breakthrough came when British intelligence identified a narrow path leading up the cliffs at Anso Fallon. Weakly defended due to French assumptions about its inaccessibility, Captain William de Laune of the Rangers had discovered the route during a reconnaissance mission, reporting that determined men could climb the steep slope under cover of darkness. Wolfe immediately recognized this intelligence as potentially decisive. Despite the enormous risks involved in moving an army up such treacherous terrain, on the night of September 12th, Wolfe implemented his audacious plan with characteristic attention to detail and personal leadership. 24 volunteers from the light infantry companies led the ascent, hauling themselves up the cliff face using roots and rocky outcroppings, while French sentries remained unaware of their approach. Colonel William Howe followed with the first wave of regular troops, establishing a secure perimeter at the top to protect the continuing ascent. By dawn on September 13th, Wolfe had successfully positioned over 4,000 troops on the Plains of Abraham, achieving complete tactical surprise and forcing Montcalm to respond to a threat he had not anticipated. The French commander, awakened by reports of British forces behind Quebec's defenses, faced an agonizing decision: retreat to Montreal and abandon Quebec, or accept battle under unfavorable conditions against an enemy that had demonstrated superior tactical mobility. Montcalm chose to fight, assembling his available forces for an immediate attack rather than waiting for reinforcements from Montreal or attempting to coordinate with forces still defending other approaches to the city. His decision reflected both personal honor and strategic calculation, allowing British forces to consolidate their position would make them nearly impossible to dislodge, while immediate action might exploit their precarious supply situation and incomplete deployment. The Battle of the Plains of Abraham lasted barely 30 minutes, but determined the fate of French North America. British disciplined volleys shattered French and Canadian attacks, while Wolfe's tactical innovations, including the use of double-shotted muskets at close range, maximized his firepower advantage. Both commanding generals fell mortally wounded. In the engagement, Montcalm struck by a musket ball while rallying his troops. Wolfe shot through the chest while leading his men forward. Governor-General Pierre de Rigaud de Vaudreuil de Cavagnel stood in the ruins of Montreal's government house, his weathered hands trembling as he signed the articles of capitulation that would end French rule in North America forever. It was September 8, 1760. The last French stronghold in Canada was about to surrender to General Geoffrey Amherst's overwhelming British force. Around the defeated governor, French officers and Canadian militia watched in stunned silence as 3 centuries of French colonial empire in the St. Lawrence Valley came to its melancholy conclusion. the year since Wolfe and Montcalm's deaths, on the Plains of Abraham had witnessed the systematic collapse of French resistance throughout North America. British forces, reinforced and resupplied, had methodically reduced French positions, while Native American allies, recognizing the shifting balance of power, gradually switched their allegiance to the victorious British. The dream of New France, stretching from the Gulf of St. Lawrence to the mouth of the Mississippi River, crumbled under the weight of British naval supremacy and colonial manpower. General Neil's three-pronged advance on Montreal represented the culmination of British strategic planning that had learned hard lessons from earlier disasters. Unlike Braddock's rigid adherence to European tactics or Abercrombie's wasteful frontal assaults, Amherst combined overwhelming force with careful logistics and respectful treatment of both colonial troops and Native American allies. His methodical approach sacrificed speed for certainty, ensuring that French resistance would be crushed systematically rather than dramatically. The human cost of the 7-year struggle had been enormous on all sides. British casualties exceeded 40,000 men, while French losses, though smaller in absolute numbers, represented a much higher percentage of their limited North American population. Colonial forces had suffered perhaps 20,000 casualties, while Native American communities had endured devastating losses that would permanently alter the balance of power throughout the continent. Casualty figures in war's conclusion. Details referenced from Fred Anderson's comprehensive analysis in Crucible of War, the 7 Years' War, and the Fate of Empire in British North America for the war's key figures. Victory and defeat carried profound personal consequences. George Washington emerged from the conflict as colonial America's most celebrated military hero. His early disasters, transformed by subsequent successes into evidence of learning and growth under pressure. The lessons he learned about wilderness, warfare, logistics, leadership would prove invaluable during the later Revolutionary War, when he would face peace. British forces as an enemy rather than an ally. Sir William Johnson's successful management of Iroquois alliances had proven crucial to British victory, but the war's end posed new challenges for his diplomatic skills. Native American communities, having supported the British cause in expectation of continued autonomy and territorial rights, would soon discover that their new allies had different concepts of land, ownership, and political sovereignty than their French predecessors. Johnson's efforts to maintain peaceful relations would become increasingly difficult as colonial settlement pressure intensified. Robert Rogers and his Rangers had demonstrated that American fighting men could master their continent's unique warfare demands when properly trained and equipped. The ranging techniques developed during the French and Indian War would influence American military doctrine for generations, while Rogers himself became a legendary figure whose exploits inspired countless stories and eventually Hollywood films. His post-war career, marked by financial difficulties and political controversies, reflected the challenges many war veterans faced in adapting to peacetime society. The war's unsung hero spies, like Marie Joseph Angelique, Native American allies, colonial women who supported military operations, countless frontier settlers who endured raids and displacement, received little recognition in official histories, but had contributed essentially to the conflict's outcome. Their sacrifices and courage represented the human foundation upon which military victories had been built, reminding historians that wars are won not only by famous generals and dramatic battles, but by ordinary people who choose sides and accept risks for causes larger than themselves. For Native American communities, the war's conclusion marked the beginning of a new and more difficult relationship with European colonial powers. French policy had generally treated Native Americans as sovereign allies, acquiring diplomatic respect and generous gift-giving, while British policy increasingly viewed them as subjects whose land rights could be subordinated to colonial expansion needs. This fundamental shift would lead to continued conflicts, including Pontiac's Rebellion in 1763 and decades of warfare as American settlement moved westward. The French and Indian War's ultimate significance extended far beyond its immediate military and political consequences. The conflict had created a generation of American military leaders, demonstrated colonial military potential, and established precedents for cooperation between different colonial regions. The war debt incurred by Britain would lead directly to taxation policies that provoked colonial resistance. While the military experience gained by Americans would prove crucial when they later fought for independence, the key figures who shaped the French and Indian war leaders like Washington and Montcalm, innovators like Rogers and Johnson, countless unsung heroes who served their chosen causes, had participated in a transformational conflict that determined North America's future. Their courage, sacrifice, and adaptability under the pressures of wilderness warfare had written a crucial chapter in the story of American development, establishing patterns of leadership, military organization, and cultural identity that would influence the continent's development for generations to come. As governor, Vaudreuil signed the capitulation documents that September Day in Montreal. He was acknowledging not merely military defeat but the end of an era. The French and Indian War had decided that North America's future would be written in English rather than French. But the men and women who fought that 7-year struggle had ensured that it would be written with distinctly American characteristics. Forged in the crucible of frontier warfare,